June 1944, Central France. Deep inside a forest erased from all maps, more than 1,000 armed men stand in silence. They are not waiting for orders from a general or a man trained for command. They are waiting for a woman the war never intended to remember. Her name is Pearl Witherington. Before night falls, her decisions will determine who advances, who disappears, and who will never be named in any report. How did someone history tried to erase come to command an army that officially never existed? By the summer of 1944, Pearl Witherington was no longer a courier, no longer a message carrier moving quietly between safe houses. She had become something the war's paperwork could not properly name. In the hills and forests of central France, more than 1,500 Maquis fighters responded to her decisions. Most were older. Many had fought before. None had been trained to take orders from a woman without rank. Her authority did not come from title or commission. It came from survival. After D-Day, German patrols tightened their grip. Radios were compromised. Leaders vanished without warning. Entire resistance cells collapsed in silence. When the previous commander was removed, there was no formal handover. There was only a vacuum, and Pearl stepped into it because no one else could. She organized supply drops under constant threat of interception. She coordinated sabotage along rail lines, feeding German units moving toward Normandy. Each operation carried consequences measured not in strategy, but in lives. A delayed signal could expose a village. A wrong location could erase an entire unit. Every instruction carried the weight of what would happen if it failed. The paradox was absolute. Her network expanded as the danger intensified. The more effective her command became, the less visible it was allowed to be in official accounts. After the war, men she had commanded received decorations. Pearl was offered recognition that did not reflect the nature of her service, while combat awards remained closed to her by policy. The war would later be described in maps and arrows, advances and retreats. What those diagrams never show is the moment when a single woman accepted responsibility for outcomes she could not fully control, and for deaths she would never be publicly permitted to claim. This was not heroism as history prefers it. It was command without commission, victory without acknowledgement, and leadership exercised in the knowledge that it might be erased the moment the war ended. Pearl Witherington was born in Paris in 1914 into a world that would soon fracture beyond recognition. Her parents were British, part of a quiet expatriate community that lived between languages and loyalties. From the beginning, her life existed on a fault line. She belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. That sense of partial belonging would later become instinct, not ideology. Her childhood unfolded in a Europe still carrying the scars of the First World War. Paris recovered on the surface, but the memory of collapse lingered beneath daily life. Pearl grew up hearing two histories spoken at once. One was British, distant and orderly. The other was French, intimate and wounded. Neither prepared her for what would happen in 1940. When German forces moved into France, the collapse was swift and total. The city where Pearl had been born became occupied territory almost overnight. Sirens, restrictions, foreign uniforms, and the steady disappearance of normal life replaced the familiar rhythms of Paris. For civilians, there was no clear line between peace and war. There was only adaptation or displacement. Pearl and her family fled. The escape was not heroic. It was crowded, uncertain, and humiliating. Trains were packed. Roads were choked with people carrying whatever they could hold. Documents mattered more than possessions. Decisions had to be made quickly, without assurance they were correct. In that movement south, Pearl learned a lesson that would never leave her. Survival often depended not on strength, but on timing, silence, and the ability to disappear. Eventually, she reached Britain. What she found there was not refuge, but distance. Britain was safe compared to occupied France, yet it felt detached from the immediacy of loss she had just experienced. She was young, bilingual, displaced, and restless. The war was no longer theoretical. It had already taken her home, Like many refugees, Pearl sought a way back into the conflict that had uprooted her, not through speeches or public declarations, but through usefulness. Her fluency in French was practical. Her familiarity with the country was rare. Her anger was controlled, internal, and disciplined. These qualities did not announce themselves. They waited. When she encountered the mechanisms of British wartime bureaucracy, she was initially absorbed into clerical work, filing, translating, supporting roles far from danger. It was acceptable, sensible, and entirely insufficient. Pearl understood something many did not. War was not only fought at the front, it was fought in movements that left no official trace. Her decision to volunteer for more dangerous service did not come from ideology or patriotism alone. It came from a refusal to accept distance. France was not an abstract battlefield to her. It was streets she recognized, accents she understood, forests she remembered. Occupation was not a headline. It was personal. By the time she was noticed by recruiters, she had already crossed an internal threshold. Fear had not disappeared, but it no longer governed her decisions. Displacement had stripped away any expectation of safety. What remained was a readiness to return to a country that no longer belonged to her, and to operate in spaces where survival depended on being underestimated. The war had not yet turned her into a commander, but it had already taught her how to live without guarantees, how to function without acknowledgement, and how to accept that the most important roles were often the least visible. By the time Pearl Witherington entered the orbit of British intelligence, the war had learned to value necessity over elegance. The Special Operations Executive did not recruit heroes. It recruited problems that needed solving. Languages, geography, nerve. Pearl offered all three without spectacle. Her French was native. Her understanding of occupied life was lived, not studied. Her motivation did not require persuasion. Training stripped away any remaining illusions. SOE instruction was brief, compressed, and unforgiving. There was no time to build confidence slowly. Weapons were introduced as tools, not symbols. Codes were memorized under pressure. Radios were treated as liabilities as much as lifelines. Instructors emphasized one principle above all others. Survival depended on discipline, not courage. A single mistake could compromise an entire circuit. Pearl absorbed the routines quietly. She was not the strongest trainee, nor the most outspoken. She learned by watching, by repetition, by refusing to draw attention to herself. Where others displayed bravado, she cultivated restraint. Instructors noted her reliability, but not her ambition. That, too, worked in her favor. Yet even within an organization built on secrecy, hierarchy persisted. Women were expected to serve as couriers, radio operators, assistants. Leadership was assumed to belong elsewhere, hinting at tradition rather than logic. Pearl did not challenge this assumption directly. She accepted her initial assignment because it placed her where she needed to be, inside France. Her insertion was deliberate and unceremonious. She was dropped into occupied territory with limited support and instructions that allowed little margin for improvisation. As a courier, her task was movement, carrying messages, connecting cells that could not safely communicate by radio, navigating checkpoints, curfews, and suspicion. Each journey required a different identity, a different posture, a different story. Early missions tested her in ways training could not. Roads changed without notice. Contacts failed to appear. Safe houses were abandoned overnight. German patrols adapted quickly. Every successful delivery carried the quiet knowledge that repetition increased risk. Familiar routes became dangerous. Familiar faces became liabilities. Pearl learned to read absence as carefully as presence. Silence could mean arrest. Delay could mean betrayal. She adjusted without instruction, altering schedules, changing meeting points, trusting instinct when protocols no longer applied. These decisions were not recorded. They were not evaluated. They were simply necessary. The deeper she moved into resistance networks, the clearer one truth became. Structure was fragile. Leadership was temporary. Survival depended on individuals who could adapt faster than the enemy. Pearl's role remained officially minor, but her exposure to the full machinery of clandestine war gave her an education few received. When losses began to mount, it was not ideology that sustained her. It was continuity. Messages still had to move. Networks still had to function. Someone had to keep the pieces connected long enough for the next operation to exist at all. By the time German pressure intensified and senior figures disappeared, Pearl had already been tested beyond the limits of her assignment. She had proven she could operate without supervision, absorb risk without hesitation, and continue functioning when structure collapsed. What she had not yet done was command. The transition did not come with orders from London or recognition from within the resistance. It arrived through absence. A senior organizer failed to appear at a rendezvous point. Then another contact vanished. Radios went silent in patterns that suggested more than coincidence. German counterintelligence was tightening its grip, not with dramatic raids, but with methodical precision. Networks that had taken months to build collapsed in days. In this environment, leadership was not assigned. It was assumed by whoever remained capable of keeping the structure alive. Pearl Witherington did not declare authority. She inherited responsibility because she was still moving, still connecting, still trusted by fragments of a system under pressure. Her advantage was not charisma or rank. It was proximity. She knew which routes were compromised and which remained usable. She knew which safe houses had gone cold and which contacts were still operational. Fighters began to turn to her not because she claimed command, but because she already held the information that mattered. Decisions followed knowledge, and knowledge followed movement. The Maquis units scattered across central France were uneven in every sense. Some were disciplined, others improvised. Many were armed but poorly trained. Most were tied to their villages and families, which made concealment fragile. They were united by occupation, not by structure. Commanding them required restraint more than force. Resistance to her authority was immediate and predictable. Some men refused to acknowledge orders that did not come from a uniform. Others questioned her legitimacy quietly, complying while withholding trust. Pearl did not attempt to overcome this through confrontation. She allowed skepticism to exist. What she required was execution. She began by stabilizing logistics. Weapons and supplies were redirected to units capable of immediate use. Drop zones were reduced to limit exposure. Training was concentrated and brief. Movement was restricted even when fighters demanded action. These decisions were unpopular. They were also effective. As pressure increased after the Allied landings, the cost of error rose sharply. German patrols expanded their reach. Arrests followed confirmable patterns. Entire cells were compromised through single points of failure. Pearl responded by enforcing compartmentalization with a severity that bordered on isolation. Units were prevented from sharing information laterally. Intelligence flowed upward, not outward. This discipline slowed operations, but it preserved continuity. Fighters who survived early sweeps began to recognize the pattern. Losses were lower where orders were followed. Exposure was reduced where movement was limited. Authority in this environment did not grow through persuasion. It grew through survival. Pearl's leadership style remained austere. There were no speeches, no appeals to ideology. Instructions were short and practical. When operations succeeded, credit was deflected. When they failed, responsibility was absorbed. Over time, skepticism hardened into reliance. Men who had questioned her decisions returned for guidance because the alternative was fragmentation. What distinguished her command was not aggression, but control. She refused operations designed for spectacle. Sabotage was calculated to disrupt supply lines without inviting retaliation that villages could not withstand. Bridges were damaged, not destroyed. Rail lines were cut where repairs would take longest. Each action was measured against its consequence, not its visibility. By the time the network expanded to more than 1,000 fighters, Pearl was no longer simply coordinating movement. She was managing exposure, morale, and the limits of endurance. Leadership had arrived without ceremony. It remained unofficial, but it was real, enforced not by authority granted, but by necessity accepted. The war did not ask whether she should command. It removed the alternatives. As the network expanded, command became less about coordination and more about consequence. Numbers created visibility. Visibility invited retaliation. Each additional fighter increased the risk not only to the group, but to the civilians who fed them, hid them, and refused to speak when questioned. Pearl understood that growth without control was not strength. It was exposure. She began to impose limits that others resisted. Recruitment was slowed. Operations were delayed or canceled outright. Fighters eager to strike saw hesitation as weakness. They measured success by action. Pearl measured it by what remained intact afterward. Her authority was tested most sharply when she said no. Command in the Maquis did not resemble conventional military leadership. There were no courts-martial, no formal discipline. Compliance depended on trust, and trust depended on outcomes. Pearl enforced discipline by insisting on consistency. Orders did not change without cause. Signals were verified twice. Meeting points were abandoned at the first sign of compromise. These habits frustrated men accustomed to improvisation, but they reduced losses. The psychological cost accumulated quietly. Each instruction carried an implicit calculation. Who would move? Who would stay? Who would be exposed if something went wrong? Pearl did not speak about these decisions. She recorded them mentally and moved on. Dwelling was not a luxury the network could afford. As German pressure intensified, interrogations became more brutal. Information extracted under torture traveled quickly. Pearl adjusted by shortening operational chains and limiting what any single fighter knew. This isolation protected the network, but it also deepened loneliness. Fighters who survived sweeps often did not know who else remained. They trusted the command structure without seeing it. Leadership, in this context, meant accepting responsibility for outcomes she could not control. A delayed supply drop could force a unit to move in daylight. A compromised courier could expose an entire route. Pearl absorbed these failures without explanation. There was no mechanism for absolution. The war demanded continuation, not reflection. The most difficult decisions involved restraint. After successful actions, momentum built. Fighters wanted to press advantage, to strike again before the enemy adapted. Pearl resisted this impulse. She understood that German forces responded asymmetrically. Each visible success increased the scale of retaliation. Villages paid the price. Her orders grew increasingly conservative as victory approached. This appeared counterintuitive to many around her. Liberation felt imminent. Risk seemed justified. Pearl saw the final phase as the most dangerous. Complacency, she knew, was fatal. The closer the end, the less margin remained for error. Authority, by then, was no longer questioned. It had been internalized. Men who had once doubted her judgment deferred without discussion. They had learned that survival followed her instructions more often than defiance. The network functioned not because it was unified, but because it was disciplined. When the fighting moved toward open confrontation and the Maquis emerged from the forests, Pearl's role did not expand with visibility. It narrowed. She focused on withdrawal, on preventing unnecessary engagements, on preserving what remained. Victory was no longer abstract. It was approaching unevenly, and she intended to meet it with as few additional losses as possible. By the time German control collapsed, Pearl had commanded an army that officially never existed. She had given orders that saved lives and orders that cost them. None of this would be reflected accurately in post-war accounts. Command had been exercised in silence, and silence would be its legacy. By late summer 1944, the Forest War had entered its most dangerous phase. German control was collapsing unevenly, and that instability made every movement unpredictable. Units pulled back from Normandy passed through regions where the Maquis operated. Retreating forces were nervous, heavily armed, and increasingly indiscriminate. What had once been a shadow conflict now risked becoming open confrontation. For Pearl Witherington, the escalation changed nothing and everything at once. The network had grown too large to disappear completely, yet too fragile to withstand direct engagement. Over 1,500 fighters were spread across forests, villages, and hills. Some were trained, many were not. All were exposed. The orders she issued during this period were not designed to win battles. They were designed to prevent annihilation. Sabotage continued, but selectively. Rail lines were disrupted just enough to delay movement, not provoke sweeping reprisals. Ambushes were authorized only where withdrawal routes were certain. The margin for error had narrowed to hours, sometimes minutes. German counterattacks intensified. Patrols pushed deeper into wooded areas. Informants multiplied under pressure. Arrests increased. Entire zones became unsafe overnight. Pearl responded by fragmenting the network further, breaking large units into smaller groups that could disperse quickly. Coordination became more complex, slower, and safer. The climax of her command was defined not by a single engagement, but by sustained restraint under pressure to act. Allied advances encouraged aggression. Fighters believed the end was near and risk acceptable. Pearl understood the paradox. The closer victory approached, the more dangerous visibility became. Retreating forces lashed out hardest when defeat felt inevitable. At one point, German units closed in on areas housing large concentrations of Maquis. Orders were issued to disperse immediately, abandoning supplies and positions that had taken months to secure. Some resisted, others complied reluctantly. Those who followed the order survived. Those who delayed paid the price. Communication faltered repeatedly. Radios failed. Couriers vanished. Decisions had to be made with partial information and executed without confirmation. Pearl operated on probabilities rather than certainty, choosing routes that minimized exposure even when they slowed coordination. Survival, not synchronization, became the priority. The final phase unfolded without ceremony. As German forces withdrew, the Maquis emerged cautiously. There was no triumphal moment within the network, no declaration of victory. Fighters returned to villages carrying weapons that could not be displayed and memories that could not be explained. The Shadow Army dissolved as quietly as it had formed. Pearl's role ended without acknowledgement. There was no formal debrief that captured the scale of her command, no record that reflected the complexity of decisions made under pressure. The war moved on to liberation narratives and public ceremonies. Her contribution remained embedded in outcomes that were never attributed to her name. The climax of her story was not a battle won, but an army preserved. An organization kept intact long enough to matter, and dissolved before it could be destroyed. Command exercised at the edge of collapse, where success was measured not by territory taken, but by lives not lost. When the fighting receded and German control finally collapsed, the war did not end cleanly for Pearl Witherington. Liberation arrived unevenly, celebrated publicly and recorded selectively. Parades marked the return of order. Medals were prepared. Narratives were drafted quickly, favoring clarity over complexity. In those early accounts, resistance was simplified into symbols. Command became a matter of rank. Leadership was assigned where it was easiest to explain. Pearl returned to a world that no longer required her decisions, but had no framework to acknowledge them either. Men she had commanded received decorations. Their actions fit existing categories of bravery and service. Hers did not. When recommendations were discussed, her name stalled at the threshold of tradition. She was informed, without ceremony, that women were not eligible for the military distinctions being considered. The explanation was procedural. The effect was final. There was no appeal process designed for her circumstances. Her command had been unofficial by necessity, and that informality now worked against her. Documentation was fragmented. Reports minimized roles that complicated post-war hierarchy. The shadow army she had held together was dissolved into local histories. Its coherence lost the moment it was no longer required. Pearl did not protest publicly. Silence, which had protected her during the war, followed her into peace. She resumed civilian life, carrying knowledge that could not be shared easily. The habits of command did not translate into recognition. Responsibility without acknowledgement left little visible trace. Years passed before partial recognition arrived, and even then it came cautiously, adjusted to fit institutional comfort. By the time honors were eventually extended, the moment they should have marked had long since faded. The delay was not an accident. It reflected a broader reluctance to confront stories that disrupted established narratives of authority. Victory had arrived, but it had not been distributed evenly. Pearl's experience exposed the distance between contribution and credit. Her war had been fought in spaces without witnesses, under conditions that resisted celebration. The cost of that invisibility endured long after the guns fell silent. What remained was a question history rarely asks directly. How many decisions that shaped outcomes were made by people never intended to be remembered? How many victories depended on authority exercised without permission, and then quietly withdrawn once it was no longer convenient to acknowledge? Pearl Witherington did not seek to reshape history's judgment. She understood its limits too well. But her story stands as evidence that success and recognition do not move together, and that some of the war's most consequential leadership occurred far from the ceremonies designed to honor it. History prefers clear hierarchies. It remembers uniforms, ranks, and ceremonies because they are easy to catalog. Pearl Witherington did not fit that structure. Her authority existed in conditions where formal permission was impossible, and where outcomes mattered more than titles. When peace returned, the space that had allowed her to lead disappeared. What followed was not erasure by force, but by convenience. The record of her service remained incomplete for decades. Official summaries acknowledged resistance activity without detailing who sustained it when leadership collapsed. Her command was referenced indirectly, absorbed into collective language that avoided assigning responsibility. The silence was not malicious. It was systematic. Recognizing her role would have required admitting that power had been exercised outside approved frameworks, and by someone the system was not designed to reward. Eventually, recognition came, delayed and diminished by time. By then, the war had settled into established narratives. Honors granted late could not alter the structure of memory that had already formed. They served as corrections, not acknowledgments. Pearl accepted them without bitterness, understanding that justice delivered after the fact rarely feels complete. Her legacy does not rest in medals or citations. It rests in continuity, in a network that survived long enough to matter, in decisions made under pressure that preserved lives without creating myths, in authority exercised quietly, then surrendered without protest when the conditions that required it ended. The question her story leaves behind is not whether she was heroic. It is whether history is capable of recognizing forms of leadership that do not announce themselves. How many individuals acted with comparable responsibility, only to vanish once their usefulness ended? How many outcomes attributed to movements or moments were shaped by people never meant to be visible? Pearl Witherington's life does not ask for revisionism. It asks for attention. It asks whether remembrance is reserved only for those who fit established patterns, or whether it can extend to those who operated beyond them. The war she fought demanded adaptability, silence, and restraint. The peace that followed had little use for those qualities. To remember her is not to elevate one name above others. It is to acknowledge that history moves through people it does not always know how to describe. Some command without rank. Some win without recognition, and some leave behind outcomes that endure long after their names fade from record.